She had not bowed before the other four councils. She would not bow before this one. Elder Saris of the Velari stood in the center of the Earth Council chamber in Geneva and held herself the way she had held herself for 180 years, straight, still, luminescent in the particular way of her people, her silver scales carrying the faint glow that meant calm, though calm was not precisely what she felt. What she felt was something that did not have a clean name, the specific exhaustion of a person who has done everything correctly and watched it fail anyway, who has made every right decision and arrived at a place that should not be the destination. Four councils. The Venari had been polite. They had expressed profound sorrow at the destruction of the Velari home world and explained, in the careful language of civilizations that have learned to say no without appearing to say no, that their current political situation made accepting refugees, even 12,000 survivors of a species 8,000 years old, inadvisable at this time. They had used the word inadvisable. She had thanked them and left. The Sorathi had been warmer and slower to reach the same answer. 3 days of genuine discussion, real engagement, actual consideration, and then the council had voted, and the vote had been close, and it had still been no. The Sorathi delegate who had voted yes found her afterward and said he was sorry and meant it, and she had thanked him for meaning it and left. The Druhari and the collective of 12 had been faster. The Druhari in 6 hours, the collective in 2. Both had cited the Droon, specifically the Droon, specifically the 40 ships that were 3 days behind her people, specifically the calculation of what accepting 12,000 Velari survivors would cost against what it would benefit, and the calculation had produced the same answer in 2 different languages. She had left. She had looked at her list, at the last name on it. Earth, humanity, a species 250 years into spacefaring, young by any measure she had ever applied to civilizations, with a history that the galactic community found alternately fascinating and concerning, with a reputation that was hard to summarize and harder to predict. She had not placed them on the list because she expected much from them. She had placed them on the list because the list was supposed to have options on it, and she had needed to put something last, and Earth had been the name available. She stood in the center of their council chamber, and she looked at the 112 representatives of humanity's governing body, and she told them the truth. Not the diplomatic version, not the version calibrated for what she thought they wanted to hear. The truth, specific, detailed, without softening, because she was 180 years old and 3 weeks away from the moment the Droon had reduced her world to ash, and she was finished with the version calibrated for what people wanted to hear. She said, "My name is Elder Saris of the Velari. My civilization was 8,000 years old. 3 weeks ago the Droon Collective destroyed our home world in 6 hours. 12,000 of my people survived. We were off-world on ships, by circumstances that had nothing to do with planning and everything to do with the particular randomness that decides who lives and who does not when a world ends. We have been traveling for 3 weeks. The Droon are 3 days behind us." She paused. She said, "I have asked 4 other civilizations for shelter. All 4 have said no. I am here because you are the last name on my list and I have nowhere else to go. I am not here to negotiate. I am not here to offer anything in exchange. I am here to ask plainly for what my people need, a place to exist, a place to be safe, a place where the Droon cannot finish what they started. I am asking this of a species I do not know well, at the end of a list I have exhausted, with 3 days before the people who destroyed my world arrive at whatever location I am in." She stopped. The chamber was silent. It was a specific kind of silence, not the silence of indifference or the silence of deliberation or the silence of discomfort. It was the silence of a room in which 112 people had just heard something true and were still inside the truth of it, had not yet found the distance from it that would allow them to process it the way they processed things that needed to be processed. She stood in it. She had said what she came to say. Whatever happened next was not in her hands. Then Senator Dale Morrow stood up. He did not ask for the floor. He did not raise his hand or signal the chair or follow the procedural protocol that the Earth Council used to manage who spoke and when. He simply stood, a large man, 67 years old, with the face of someone who had been making decisions for a long time and the posture of someone who had grown up working and had never entirely grown out of it. He said, "I call for a vote." The council chair said, "Senator, debate has not." Morrow said, "I call for a vote." A pause. The chair looked at the room, at 112 representatives who were still inside the truth of what the elder had said and who were, Saris could see, not in the mood for debate. The chair called the vote. It took 4 minutes. 81%. Yes. She found Senator Morrow in the corridor outside the chamber. Not deliberately. She was walking and he was walking, and the corridor produced them at the same moment, moving in the same direction, and he looked at her and stopped, and she stopped, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. She said, "Why did you stand?" He said, "Because someone had to go first." She said, "That is not what I mean. I mean, why did you vote yes? Not strategically, personally. You are a senior senator of a young species. The Droon have 40 ships. This will cost you something real. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. They were still in the corridor, outside a room where history had just been made in 4 minutes. And he was being quiet the way people are quiet when they are looking for the true answer rather than the available one. He said, "My grandfather came to Montana with nothing. He was a refugee from a war, from a place that had become impossible to stay in. He came with the clothes he was wearing and a name, and everything else had to be built from that." He looked at the floor for a moment. He said, "Somebody took him in. Not because they were required to, not because there was a law or a treaty or an obligation, because he showed up and he needed help and helping was the thing to do." He paused. He spent the rest of his life in Montana. He had children. His children had children. I exist because someone decided that a stranger who needed help was worth the trouble of helping. He looked at her. He said, "The measure of what you are is what you do when it costs something. When it is easy, it does not tell you much about what you are. When it costs something, when there are 40 ships 3 days behind the person asking, and the math does not work in your favor and every other civilization on the list has already said no, that is when you find out what you actually are." Saris looked at him, at his face, which was the face of a man who had arrived at a conclusion 40 years ago and had been living inside it ever since. She said, "My people have a saying. The measure of a civilization is what it protects." He said, "That's a good saying." She said, "I thought so. I am beginning to think it is also a test." He said, "Yes, I think it might be." They stood in the corridor for a moment longer. Then he said, "We have work to do," and he pulled out a notebook, paper, actual paper, which she found inexplicable and somehow exactly right, and opened it. "Let's start with what your people need immediately and work forward from there." She looked at the notebook. She said, "You write by hand." He said, "Helps me think. Something about the physical act of it, it makes the things I write down feel more real, more committed." She said, "My people had a similar practice, before." He said, "Tell me about it while we walk. I want to know about your people. All of it, not the crisis, the civilization. 8,000 years is a long time. I want to understand who we're helping." She looked at him. She said, "You want to know who we were?" He said, "I want to know who you are. Where is just where you're coming from." She walked beside him and she told him. Admiral Yara Akafer's briefing to the Earth Council was not what they expected. They expected strategy. They expected the presentation of a defensive plan, the layout of available resources, the mapping of options against outcomes. They expected the particular narrative structure of military briefings, which moved from problem to analysis to solution in a way that implied more certainty than military situations actually contained. What they got instead was truth. She stood at the front of the chamber, straight, precise, in her dress uniform, because the occasion was formal even if the content was going to be anything but diplomatic, and she began with the numbers. She said, "The Droon have 40 ships. Earth has 23 available in the operational timeframe that matters for this situation. The Droon have been conducting operations of this type for 3 centuries. Earth has been in one significant military engagement. In that engagement, we performed better than any pre-engagement analysis projected and worse than we needed to. Those are the numbers." She paused. She said, "I want to be clear about something before I continue. I am not about to tell you we cannot do this. I am not about to recommend we stand down. I am going to tell you exactly what doing this means, and I am going to ask you to choose with full information, because choosing with full information is the only choice that is actually yours." She looked at the room. She said, "Protecting 12,000 Velari survivors means positioning human assets between those survivors and a Droon fleet. It means that fleet will arrive, will assess the situation, and will make a decision based on what they find. If what they find is a defensive position that makes the cost of proceeding higher than the benefit of proceeding, they will withdraw. If what they find is insufficient, they will proceed. The question is not whether we can defend. The question is whether what we build is sufficient to change the Droon's calculation." A council member said, "Can we build something sufficient?" Akafir said, "Yes. It will require everything we have available and 11 assets that I will deploy in a manner I am not going to detail in open session for operational reasons." She paused. "It will require that we commit completely and visibly, that the Droon understand when they arrive that we are not here by accident or mistake, that we are here deliberately and entirely, and that proceeding means a cost they will need to calculate carefully." She looked at the room. "The Droon are not cruel. They are efficient. They do not take losses they do not need to take. Our job is to make the losses they would need to take in order to reach the Velari larger than any territorial calculation can justify." Senator Morrow said, "Do it." Akafir said, "I need a formal vote." The vote took 3 minutes. 93%. She went to do what needed doing. Thomas Nkosi had built 3 colony stations in his career. He had built the first one in 4 months, which his supervisors at the time had described as impossible, and which he had completed in 4 months because he had decided 4 months was the timeline and had organized everything around that decision. He had built the second in 11 weeks, which his supervisors had also described as impossible, and the third in 9 weeks for the same reason. He had never built a home before. He understood the distinction the moment Morrow explained the assignment to him. Not a station, not a camp, a home for 12,000 people who had lost everything, who were arriving with nothing, who needed not just shelter but the specific experience of being somewhere that was theirs. He sat with the distinction for 20 minutes before he called his team. When he called them, he said, "We are building a home, not housing, a home. The difference is whether the people who live in it believe they belong there. Our job is to build something that makes 12,000 people who have never been to Kepler 62F believe that they belong there. That is the design brief. Everything else is secondary." His lead architect said, "We have 40 days and 10,000 workers." He said, "We have 37. Plan for 37. Build for 37. If we have 40, we will have done things right and had 3 days extra." She said, "Do we have Velari design resources? Cultural documentation, architectural tradition, aesthetic references?" He looked at her. He said, "We have 6 days before the advance team needs to be on site. Get everything you can find, everything. Museum records, academic papers, trade documentation, anything that tells you how the Velari built things, how they thought about space, what beauty meant to them, what home meant to them." She said, 6 days is not very long." He said, "No, so start now." She started now. 6 days of research produced something unexpected. The Velari had a central design principle that appeared in every form of their architecture across 8,000 years of civilization. A principle so consistent that Nkosi's architectural team identified it within the first 2 days and spent the remaining 4 understanding it well enough to use it correctly. The principle was light. Not decorative light, structural light. The Velari built around the movement of light through space, around the way illumination changed the quality of a place, around the specific experience of being in a room or a public space, or an outdoor area where the light was doing something intentional, where it came from a direction that mattered, landed on surfaces that were chosen for how they received it, moved through a day in a way that connected the people inside the space to the larger movement of the world around them. They did not separate beauty from function. They considered light to be both simultaneously practically necessary and aesthetically essential, a design element as fundamental as structure. Nkosi stood in his mobile construction office on Kepler 62F and looked at his architectural team's adaptation of this principle and said, "This is the central space. Everything else organizes around this." The central space was a plaza, large enough for the community to gather, small enough to feel like a place rather than an area. It was designed around Kepler 62F star and the specific quality of its light, which was warmer and slightly more orange than Earth's sun, which produced a quality on stone and water and growing things that Nkosi's architects had spent 3 days calibrating precisely. At the center of the plaza, a structure, stone and water and light, the elements the Velari had always used when they built things meant to be gathering places, meant to be the center of a community's life. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Build it first. Before the housing, before the infrastructure, before anything else. Build this first so it is already there when they arrive." His construction chief said, "That's not standard sequencing." He said, "I know, build it first." They built it first. Around it, in 37 days, they built everything else. Streets that had been designed with the input of Velari cultural documentation, not copies of Velari design, which would have been wrong, but something informed by it, something that held the memory of what the Velari had valued while being clearly and honestly new. Gardens, because the Velari were people who had valued growing things. Structures that were functional and did not pretend to be more than functional, but had been built with enough care and enough attention that the functionality did not exhaust what they were. On day 37, Nkosi stood in the central plaza and looked at what 10,000 people had built in 37 days and said nothing for a while. His construction chief stood beside him. She said, "It's not perfect." He said, "No." She said, "There are things I would change if we had more time." He said, "There always are." She said, "Do you think they'll?" He said, "I don't know." He looked at the plaza. The light was doing what the architects had calibrated it to do, landing on stone and water in the specific way that the Velari had always built toward. "I hope so." The next day, the Velari arrived. 12,000 people came off the transport ships in the careful, quiet way of people who have been holding themselves together for a long time and are not sure yet whether they are allowed to stop. They came through the receiving area and out into the settlement, and they moved through the streets in the particular way of people who are looking at everything and are not ready to have feelings about any of it, because having feelings required believing that this was real and real required trust and trust required time they had not yet had. Saris walked in front. She walked the way she had stood in the Earth Council chamber, straight, still, present. She moved through what had been built for her people, and she looked at it the way she had looked at everything for 3 weeks, with the specific attentiveness of a leader who cannot afford to miss anything, because missing things had consequences for the people behind her. Then she reached the central plaza. She stopped. The light was doing what it was supposed to do. The stone was doing what stone does when it has been chosen correctly and placed correctly, and the light that falls on it is the right light at the right angle. The water in the center structure was moving in the way the Velari had always made water move when they built things that were meant to mean something. Sarah stood in the central plaza of a settlement built in 37 days by a species she had not known well 3 weeks ago, and she looked at what they had built, and her scales went very bright. The Velari response to strong emotion, the thing that happened when what was felt was too large for any other expression. She put her hand on the stone at the center of the plaza. She stood there for a full minute. Nkosi was standing 20 meters away. He watched her stand there, and he did not move toward her, and he did not speak, and he did not do anything except allow what was happening to happen, because he had built things for 30 years, and he understood the moment when a thing became real for the person it was built for, and he understood that the correct response to that moment was to stand back and let it be what it was. Behind Saris, the 12,000 filed into New Velara. Behind Nkosi, 10,000 construction workers began the process of standing down, of packing their equipment, of preparing to leave the place that was not theirs and returning to the places that were. In the central plaza, in the light that was almost right, Elder Saris of the Velari stood with her hand on stone, and her scales very bright, and did not speak. She did not need to. Private First Class Amara Webb was 24 years old and had been in the Earth Defense Forces for 3 years, and had specifically requested the New Velara posting because she spoke 2 languages well and had grown up in a family that believed strongly in the idea that being present when you could be present was not optional. She arrived on day 4 and was assigned to perimeter patrol, the outer edge of the settlement, a routine rotation designed more to be visible than to be necessary, because the Droon were not expected to use ground forces, and the settlement's real defense was in orbit. Still, Akafar planned for everything, and perimeter patrol was part of planning for everything, and Amara Webb walked her rotation with the seriousness she applied to everything she did. She met Soli on day 3 of her rotation. Not met precisely, became aware of. Soli was 8 years old and silver-scaled, and had the particular quality of a child who has learned to be near adults without being noticed, who has discovered that the space just outside adult attention is safe, and has made her home there. She was at the edge of the perimeter when Amara came around the corner, sitting on the ground, notebook open, drawing with an instrument that was Velari in design, and produced lines of a fineness that Amara had not seen from any tool she recognized. Amara looked at her. At the drawing, something large and detailed and clearly from memory, a city or a landscape or both simultaneously, with the quality of a place that has been looked at so many times it can be reproduced exactly even when the original is gone. She sat down nearby. Not next to Soli. Nearby, 3 meters, the distance that said I am here but I am not requiring anything of you, which was a distance she had learned from watching how the Velari adults managed space, and which seemed to be the right distance for a child who had learned that nearby was safer than close. Soli kept drawing. After an hour, Soli turned the notebook and held it toward Amara. Amara looked at the drawing. It was a city, a Velari city, she understood, the home world that was gone, rendered in lines so precise and so loving that she understood immediately that this was not practice. This was documentation. This was a child keeping a record of something that no longer existed so that the knowledge of how it had looked would not be lost. She looked at it for a long time. She said it was beautiful. Soli looked at her. Not the sideways not quite looking that she had been doing since Amara sat down, a direct look, the look of someone who has heard something real and is registering it. Then she took the notebook back and kept drawing. The next afternoon, Amara found her in the same place. She sat nearby. Soli drew. After 40 minutes, Soli moved 3 meters closer. After an hour, she showed Amara the drawing. This became the routine. Amara did not try to make it more than it was. She did not push for language or connection or the visible markers of relationship. She sat nearby and she looked at the drawings when they were offered, and she said true things about them because the drawings were worth true things. She did not ask solely to speak. She did not ask her to be anything other than exactly what she was. A child with a notebook and a record to keep, and the particular kind of hurt that was not going to be fixed by anything anyone did, only by time and safety, and the slow accumulation of moments that were not terrible. She gave her those every afternoon, without asking for anything in return. HFY's long-range sensors flagged the drone fleet at 3:12 hours. She was already awake. She had been awake for 22 hours, which was not unusual for the days before an expected engagement, and she was at her command console with her tea gone cold beside her when the alert came through, and she looked at it and confirmed what she had been expecting to confirm. 40 ships. Kepler 62 system edge. Arrival vector, exactly where she had predicted. She opened channels to her fleet commanders and said 3 words. They are here. Then she began the sequence she had been building for 37 days. The specific, precise, carefully ordered activation of a defensive arrangement that looked like one thing from the outside and was another thing entirely. And the difference between what it looked like and what it was had been the center of her planning since the day the Council voted yes. The drone fleet moved through the outer system in the configuration they used for operations of this type, not a battle formation, not a display formation, the specific arrangement of a fleet that expects minimal resistance and has organized itself for efficient completion of an objective. They had done this 6 times. They knew how it went. They had a model for it, and the model worked, and they were inside the model, and the model told them what they would find. They hailed at 4:41. Krethvar appeared on her display, gray-skinned, methodical, with the bearing of a senior military officer who considers what he does to be administration rather than war, which was, HFY had decided in the 37 days she had spent thinking about him, the most genuinely frightening thing about the drone. He said, Admiral HFY of the Earth Defense Forces, you are positioned in a system that is the subject of a drone territorial administration matter. I am asking you to stand aside and allow the completion of that matter. She said, I understand what you're asking. He said, then you understand that we have 40 ships and you have 23, and the mathematics of this situation are not favorable to your position. She said, I understand the mathematics. He said, then stand aside. She said, no. He said, the Velari are not your people. She said, they are now. A silence, brief, the drone were not given to theatrical pauses. He said, I will give you 6 hours to reconsider. She said, I will not need 6 hours. He said, I think you will. She said, then we disagree, Admiral. She held his gaze through the display. Is there anything else? He said, not at this time. The channel closed. She turned to her tactical officer and said, begin the approach sequence. Slow, let them come in. In New Velara, the alert came at 4:47. Amara was already on rotation, 400 shift, the early morning patrol in the dim light of Kepler 62F's long dawn. She heard the alert tone in her earpiece and heard the duty officer's voice immediately after. All personnel to defensive positions. This is not a drill. Maintain calm. Move civilians to designated shelter areas. She was at the eastern perimeter. She moved. The shelter areas had been planned by HFY's ground team, not because the drone were expected to reach the ground, but because HFY planned for everything, and everything included scenarios that were not expected. The shelter areas were the most structurally reinforced buildings in the settlement, built to a standard that Nkosi had been specific about in a way that his construction team had not fully understood until the ground defense briefing. She was moving toward Shelter Station 4 when she checked the positions and found that Soli was not in the system. Not logged as entered, not logged as anywhere. She changed direction. She found Soli at their spot. The eastern perimeter, the place they had been meeting every afternoon for 3 weeks, sitting on the ground, drawing. The alert tone was audible from here, not loud, but present, the pulse of it moving through the early morning air of New Velara. And Soli had heard it and was still here, still drawing, with the particular quality of a child who has already been through the thing that is supposed to be the worst thing, and has therefore reorganized her relationship with fear into something that does not look like what adults expect fear to look like. Amara crouched beside her. She said solely, "We need to go inside." Soli kept drawing. Amara looked at the drawing. It was different from the others, not the home world, not the cities of memory. It was New Velara. The settlement, the streets, the central plaza. And in the drawing, 2 figures, one human, one Velari child, sitting near each other in the particular way they sat near each other every afternoon. The distance that was not far and not close and was exactly right. She looked at it for one moment. Then she picked Soli up, gently, completely, the way you pick up someone small and important, with both arms settled securely, no possibility of dropping. Soli made a small sound that was not protest, something more like acknowledgement. She kept the notebook in her hands. She kept drawing, or the motions of drawing, against the notebook cover, even as Amara carried her. Amara moved toward Shelter Station 4. She was 40 meters from the entrance when the power coupling in the section of the shelter's external wall failed. It failed in the specific way that power couplings fail in buildings that have been built fast under pressure, not catastrophically, not with warning, but with the sudden wrongness of a structural element that has reached its limit in a single moment rather than approaching the limit gradually. The wall section above the shelter entrance shifted. Not much. Enough. Amara saw it shift. She had 40 meters and the time it took for a structural element to fall, and she made the calculation that she made because it was the only calculation available, and because Soli was in her arms and the calculation was not complicated. She turned her body. She covered Soli completely. The section came down. It was not the roof. It was not a catastrophic failure. A ceiling panel, 2 meters of reinforced material that was reinforced enough to do what it needed to do and heavy enough to do damage, and not heavy enough to do more than that, probably, depending on how you fell and what you absorbed with what part of your body. Amara absorbed it with her shoulder and her back. She was on the ground. Soli was in her arms. The debris was around them, and Amara's shoulder was a specific kind of wrong, and her back was telling her something she would need to address shortly, and she said, because it was the first and most important question, "Hey, you okay?" She looked at Soli. Soli was looking at her. Not the careful sideways attention of 3 weeks. Not the not quite looking of a child who has learned that direct attention costs something. Full, direct, completely present, the look of a child who has just watched something happen and has understood what it means, who has connected the action to the intention behind it with the specific clarity that children have when something bypasses their uncertainty and goes straight to the place where things are simply known. Soli's scales were very bright, brighter than Amara had ever seen them, brighter than she had known they could be. Then Soli said, "Amara." Just that, just the name. One word spoken in the voice of a child who had not spoken in 3 weeks, in a voice that was small and clear and real, the way first words after silence are always real in a way that words after speech cannot quite be. Amara looked at her. She said, "Yeah." She felt her shoulder registering its complaint with increasing specificity and decided to deal with that in a moment. She said, "I'm here." Soli put her small hand on Amara's face. Amara closed her eyes. Above New Velara, HFY was counting. The Droon fleet had entered the inner system at 600, moving on the approach vector she had predicted, in the formation she had predicted, with the confidence of a fleet that had done this 6 times and had a model that worked. At 7:14, they crossed the line. She said, "Bring them up." 11 ships came up from the asteroid belt of Kepler-62, not one direction, not two, 4 simultaneous vectors, surrounding the drone's forward element with a geometry that was not accidental and was not aggressive and was completely unambiguous. This was not an attack. This was an announcement. The announcement was, "You have entered a position that is different from the position you thought you were entering. Please update your model." The drone fleet stopped. The hesitation was brief, 3 minutes, which was, HFY understood, not indecision but calculation. The drone recalculating, running their model against the new information, finding that the new information did not fit the model and that the model needed adjustment. 3 drone ships engaged. Her response was precise, not punitive, precise. The specific application of force necessary to demonstrate capability without creating a situation that had no resolution available except escalation. 3 drone ships disabled in 4 minutes, 14 seconds. Not destroyed, disabled, floating, their crews alive, their ships recoverable. The message in the precision was part of the message. She could have done more. She had not done more because more was not the point. The point was the calculation. The drone calculated. They were efficient, not cruel, and efficiency required accurate calculation, and the accurate calculation of this situation was now available to them in the form of 3 disabled ships and 34 human vessels holding position around a settlement built in 37 days on a world that had not been a human world 3 months ago. She watched the drone fleet on her display. She watched Krethvar's flagship running its updated calculations. She drank her cold tea and waited. At 8:47, Krethvar opened a channel. Not to her. To Elder Saris, on the surface of New Velara. HFY patched in silently. Saris had authorized her to monitor all incoming communications, and listened. Krethvar said, "Elder, we are withdrawing." Saris said, "Permanently." A silence, the particular silence of a military commander who is making a statement he has not made before and is choosing his words carefully. He said, "The Velari are under human protection. This makes them a different calculation." Saris said, "I understand what different calculation means." He said, "I thought you would." She said, "Admiral, one question." He said, "Yes." She said, "The 6 species before us, did any of them have protection?" He said, "No." She said, "Then they were the same calculation." He said, "Yes." She said, "I see." He said, "Elder, for what it is worth, the Droon do not enjoy what we do. We do what is necessary for the expansion of our civilization. When the cost exceeds the benefit, we do not proceed." He paused. "You have found a protector whose cost we cannot absorb. That changes the calculation. Permanently." She said, "Then I will say what my people say in such moments." He said, "What is that?" She said, "May you find what you are looking for without taking what belongs to someone else." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a generous thing to say." She said, "We are a generous people." The channel closed. HFY watched the Droon fleet reconfigure. Watched 40 ships move from approach formation to transit formation with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a fleet that is leaving on its own terms and wants that understood. Watched them go through the outer system, to the edge, to FTL transit, to gone. She said to her tactical officer, "Status on New Velara." Her tactical officer said, "All clear below. 1 ground unit casualty, Private Webb, non-critical, shoulder and back. She's in the medical bay." HFY said, "And the child?" Her tactical officer looked at her, said, "Ma'am." HFY said, "The child she was with, the Velari girl." A brief pause, then, uninjured. She's in the medical bay with Private Webb, ma'am. They're saying she hasn't left her side. Akefer nodded. She said, send the all clear, stand down from alert status, maintain orbital watch. She looked at the display, at the empty approach vector, at 34 human ships holding position above a settlement built in 37 days on a world that was now, officially and permanently, home to 12,000 people who had needed a home. She picked up her cold tea. She drank it. The medical bay in New Velara was functional and clean, and had been built with the same attention that had been applied to everything else. Not beautiful, not trying to be, but built with enough care that the functionality was not the only thing it was. Amara was in a bed with her shoulder and back treated, and her arm in the specific kind of support that meant 3 weeks of limited rotation, and her prognosis being described by the medical officer as completely fine, which she knew was accurate, and which she was not yet fully feeling because the adrenaline was still present, and the adrenaline had a way of making completely fine feel uncertain. Soli was beside her. She had not left. She had been beside Amara since the debris was cleared, since the medical team arrived, since the all-clear came through the settlement, through the treatment and the assessment and the move to the medical bay. She was in the chair beside Amara's bed with her notebook open, and she was drawing. Amara looked at the ceiling and felt the particular physical unpleasantness of recent injury, resolving into something more manageable, and thought about the words Soli had said. Just the one word, just the name. She had been thinking about it since the moment it happened, and she was not done thinking about it, and she suspected she would not be done thinking about it for a long time. Elder Saris came at 1100. She came through the medical bay door, and she looked at Amara in the bed, and she looked at Soli in the chair beside it, drawing, scales still brighter than their resting state, and she stood in the doorway and looked at this for a moment before she moved. She came and stood beside the bed. She said, Soli. Soli looked up. Saris said something in Velari, something soft, something that Amara's translator rendered haltingly as something like, you spoke, little one. She said it the way you say something you have been hopping for and had stopped letting yourself hope for. Soli looked at Amara. Then she turned back to her drawing. Saris looked at the drawing. At New Velara rendered in precise lines, the streets, the central plaza, the light on the stone, the human warships visible above the settlement as small shapes in the sky. A record, a documentation, the same practice that had preserved the memory of a home world, now turned toward a new home. She looked at Amara. She said, she has not spoken since the day our world was destroyed. Amara said, I know. Saris said, what you did in the corridor. Amara said, I just covered her. Saris said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. In my people's philosophy, the act of covering, of placing yourself between harm and another, is one of the oldest and most fundamental acts. We have a word for it. It is the same word we use for home, the same word, because a home is a place that covers you. Amara looked at the ceiling. She said, someone told me, the measure of a civilization is what it protects. Saris said, that is my people's saying. Amara said, I know. Senator Morrow told me, when I got the posting. He said it and then said it was a Velari saying, and he thought it was the best description of what we were trying to do that he had found. Saris said, Morrow. Amara said, yes. Saris looked at Soli, at the drawing, at the warships rendered in small, careful lines above a settlement that had been built in 37 days on a world that was now home. She said, I think now the saying belongs to both of us. Amara said, I think it always did, we just didn't know it yet. Senator Morrow came to New Velara 6 weeks after the Droon withdrew. He came with Nkosi, because Nkosi had built the place, and the person who built a place should be present when the person who authorized the building came to see what had been made. They walked through it together, the two men, moving through streets that were inhabited now, that had the quality streets acquire when people have been living in them long enough to begin to feel like theirs. They walked past the housing and the gardens and the community buildings, and the spaces that were becoming the specific kinds of spaces that become specific kinds of spaces when people use them for specific kinds of things. Past the area where a Velari cultural archive was being established. Not a museum, a living archive. The Velari scholars working with Earth's archivists to build something that would hold the record of 8,000 years of civilization for whatever came next. Past the school, where Velari children and the children of Earth's construction workers, who had chosen to stay sat in adjacent spaces that were not quite together and were less separate every week. They walked in silence for most of it, because Morrow was a man who believed in seeing things before speaking about them, and knew Velara required seeing. At the central plaza they stopped. The light was doing what it was built to do. Kepler 62 F* was at the angle that produced the specific quality on the stone that Nkosi's architects had spent 3 days calibrating, and the water in the center structure was moving in the way that Velari water features moved when they had been designed correctly, and the plaza was inhabited. Velari and humans in the space together, the easy intermixture of people who have been sharing a place long enough to stop organizing themselves by origin. Children in the plaza. Velari children in the particular luminescent brightness of children who are playing, their scales cycling through colors with the unself-conscious frequency of small beings who have not yet learned to manage their emotional displays. Human children who had learned in 6 weeks that the brightness was feeling made visible and had begun, without being taught, to read it. Morrow watched them for a while. He said to Nkosi, "You built a home." Nkosi said, "That was the assignment." Morrow said, "How did you know how?" Nkosi thought about it. He said, "I asked myself what I would need if I were them. If everything I had was gone and someone was building me somewhere to be, what would make it a home instead of a shelter?" He paused. I decided the answer was a center, something at the middle of it that said this place has a heart, that the people who built it knew you well enough to build something that felt like it was built for you specifically, not for anyone who needed somewhere to be. He looked at the plaza. He said, "I'm not sure we got it right. I'm not sure anyone can get it completely right in 37 days, but I think we got close enough that they can make the rest of it themselves." Morrow watched the children. He said, "My grandfather, when he came to Montana, the people who took him in, they didn't build him anything. They gave him a room and work and eventually land. But what he always said was that what they gave him was normalcy. The experience of being treated like his presence was not a problem to be managed, but a thing that was simply happening, like weather, like seasons. He was there and they were there and they figured it out." He was quiet. He said, "I think that's what Nkosi built. Not just structures. The normalcy of being somewhere that was built with you in mind." Nkosi said, "I had good people, 10,000 of them. None of them thought this was optional or secondary. They worked like it mattered." Morrow said it did. Nkosi said, "I know." They stood in the central plaza in the light that was almost right and watched people who had come from a destroyed world moving through a space that had been built for them by people who had never met them and had come anyway. And it was not perfect, and it was not the home that had been lost, and it was exactly what it needed to be. Morrow found Saris at the edge of the settlement. The far perimeter, the place where New Velara ended and the planet began, where the built space gave way to the natural geography of Kepler 62F, which was gentle and green, and had a quality in its light and air that was not Earth's quality, and not the Velari home world's quality, and was its own thing, the specific character of a world that had been uninhabited until recently and was now, in the way that worlds become inhabited, being known. She was looking at it, at the planet beyond the settlement, at the hills in the distance and the sky above them, and the particular color of the light on both. He stood beside her. They were quiet for a while, The way people who have been through something together can be quiet. Not the silence of strangers, but the silence of a shared history, of having been in the same room when something important happened, and knowing that the other person was also in the room. She said, I have been trying to find a word. He said, for what? She said, for humanity, for what you are. I have been looking for it since 17 ships dropped out of FTL 6 hours after my memorial. He said, have you found it? She turned to look at him. Her scales were bright, the specific brightness he had learned to read over 6 weeks, the brightness that meant something felt deeply. She said, my people had a word. For the civilization that takes you in when every other door is closed. That builds you a home and stands between you and the thing that destroyed your world and keeps standing there, past the point where the math works in their favor, past the point where the reasonable calculation says step aside. The civilization that does that. He said, what word? She said, kin. He looked at her. She said, it is the oldest word in our language. Older than our written records, it appears in oral tradition going back to the earliest Velari communities. It means the people who are yours and whom you are part of, not by birth but by choice. By the specific choice to be present when presence costs something. She looked back at the planet. She said, I have been trying to find the right word since the vote, since the ships came, since Nkosi built a central plaza with our light, since a soldier covered a child with her body in a corridor during an alert. She paused. I have found it. Morrow looked at the hills, at the sky, at the settlement behind them, New Velara, 12,000 people building something new from what remained of what they had been. He said, that's a good word. She said, my people have always thought so. I think now it is yours too. He said, I think we've been trying to earn it for a while. She said, I think you have. They stood at the edge of the settlement, as the light of Kepler 62F moved through its long afternoon, the specific quality of it landing on the hills and the grass and the built spaces of New Velara in a way that was its own thing. Not Earth's light, and not the light of a world that no longer existed, but the light of the place that was home now. A child's voice behind them, laughter, the particular frequency of a child who has remembered how to find something funny, which requires a level of safety that is not assumed but earned. They turned. A group of children in the plaza, Velari scales flickering through play colors, human children trying to replicate the pattern and producing something that was not quite right and entirely charming. Saris watched them. She said, the measure of a civilization is what it protects. Morrow said, yes. She said, I think we have found out what you are. He said, what's that? She looked at him, scales bright, the word she had been looking for present in her expression before she said it. She said, kin. Above New Velara, the warships held. They would hold tomorrow. They would hold as long as holding was what was needed, which Akafor had assessed as a minimum of 2 years and a maximum of as long as necessary. And as long as necessary was the timeline she had briefed and the council had approved, because some things did not have timelines that convenience could set. They would hold. Below them, in the streets and the gardens and the central plaza with its Velari light, 12,000 people who had been given a name, not refugees, not survivors, not guests, not temporary residents of a place that was not quite theirs. A name older than records, older than the oldest thing the Velari had written down. Kin. In the medical bay, Amara Webb was 2 weeks into her 3-week recovery and had been told twice by the medical officer to stop attempting rotation with her arm in support, and had complied in the technical sense that she was not on rotation and had found other ways to be useful that did not require her arm. Soli came every afternoon, drew in her notebook, showed Amara the drawings. Spoke now not much, not constantly, but the words were coming back one by one in the way words come back when they are ready, and every word was received with the specific care of people who understand what it cost. In the central plaza, the light did what it had been built to do. In the archive building, Velari scholars worked with Earth archivists on the record of 8,000 years of civilization that would not be lost. In the schools, children who had not known each other 6 weeks ago were beginning the process of knowing each other that would take years and produce something that neither of their civilizations had produced before. Thomas Nkosi, on a transport back to Earth, sat with his notebook. He had started keeping a notebook sometime in the last 37 days because he had watched Morrow use one and had decided there was something to it and wrote one line in it. The line was, "A home is a place where the people who built it knew you well enough to put the light in the right place." He looked at it for a moment. Then he wrote, "We got close enough." Then he closed the notebook and looked out at the stars and thought about the next thing, because there was always a next thing, because that was the nature of building. You finished one and the next one was waiting, and the next one mattered as much as the one you had just finished. And that was the whole point. That was the reason. That was what made the building worth doing. There was always something to build. There was always someone who needed it. That was the answer to every question about why. That was the answer Senator Morrow gave to the farmer's question. That was the answer Akafor gave with 11 ships that appeared where there had been none. That was the answer Nkosi gave with a central plaza calibrated to Velari light. That was the answer Amara Webb gave with her body in a corridor during an alert. Why? Because that was what they did. Because that was what they were. Because kin was not a word you were given. It was a word you earned. Above New Valera, in the dark above a world that was home now, the warships held. They would hold. They always did.